The Simpson Desert. Covering some 176,000 square kilometres across 2 states and 1 territory, the area forms part of the Lake Eyre Basin. Its parallel dune systems are the longest in the world, with some of the ridges remaining unbroken for 200 kilometres. Part of the traditional homelands of the Wangkangurru people for thousands of years, the first European to glimpse the desert was Charles Sturt on his infamous 1844 expedition. In 1880, the surveyor Augustus Popel marked the intersection of the Queensland Northern Territory and South Australian borders in the desert's southeast. Then, in 1886, David Lindsay, aided by a Wangkangurru man, travelled eastwards from the western edge of the desert, making it as far as Popel's Corner. Later, in 1936, Ted Colson crossed the desert from the northwest, following the parallel dunes for much of the way. Apart from these few forays, the area remained largely uncharted and unknown to Europeans until well into the 20th century. Now maybe it was a result of the terrible experiences he had in Antarctica under Mawson's leadership. Or perhaps it was just a natural explorer's instinct. But Madigan too had begun to focus his research and exploration on the arid interior of the Australian continent. Geographically, environmentally, and physically, about as far from the polar regions as one can get. He served as an officer with the Royal Engineers during the First World War and saw action in the Battle of Loos and the Battle of the Somme. Then, in 1929, on behalf of the Royal Geographical Society, he undertook to survey the area now known as the Simpson Desert, using a process called aerial strip photography. The president of the Geographical Society at the time was Alfred Allen Simpson, and Madigan named the area after him. 10 years later, Madigan was tasked with leading a land-based expedition, crossing the desert from west to east. Madigan chose camels as his primary means of transportation. It was a fitting choice, since this was the last real exploration of any significance into the remote reaches of the Australian continent. Just as Burke and Will's ill-fated endeavour in 1860 had been the first to use camels, Madigan's 1939 crossing of the Simpson would be the last. The expedition would attempt to cross roughly 500 miles of desert from Andado Station to Birdsville through the area's geographical centre. It consisted of 9 men, including Jack Bejar, chosen for his excellent camel handling skills and described by Madigan as a fine, sturdy fellow and key member of the expedition. He was the son of the legendary pioneering Afghan cameleer Dervish Bejar of Maree. R.A. Simpson, the son of Alfred Simpson, the Geographical Society president after whom the area was named. And an Aboriginal man we know only as Andy, who was to become a much valued and respected member of the group, providing real insight into a culture and a way of life very few at the time understood. Finally, as you can see, June flag's gone up, the flag's up, the beer's out. The West End, you're drinking there, Greg?
Yeah, it should be NT.
And, yeah. And after all that, we're finally about to start the Madigan. And I think, you know what? This is the toughest and longest Simpson Desert crossing of all of the different crossings. And I think it's going to be a doddle after what we've just been through. Anyway. How very wrong that prediction would turn out to be. Just as he had done in Antarctica, Madigan soon established himself as a natural leader. Although his disciplined and regimented style was not embraced by all. Most notably, the young R.A. Simpson and David Marshall. Right from the outset, it was clear that the expedition would be a serious scientific endeavour, with all contingencies meticulously planned for. There were no high adventures, Madigan would later write, which are usually due to incompetence or invention. But nevertheless, the spirit of adventure was not lacking. So the old Handado station here, this is a heritage listed, it's no longer operating, but this is the beginning of Madigan's expedition. This is where he started from here, Handado station, and I actually have it on good authority that it was Tom Cruise himself, the famous Birdsville mailman, who delivered the stores and supplies down this track, which is now known as the Bins track, for here to the beginning of Madigan's expedition. Now, the first vehicle crossing was actually the great pioneering geologist Reg Sprigg, and I've actually spoken to his son Doug. Reg was taught under the equally famous and great Douglas Mawson. In fact, Reg's son Doug is named because of Douglas Mawson. But Reg Sprigg was well known for his establishment of the oil and gas fields in the Cooper Basin, and today we have those oil fields are all around Strzelecki, and you know Santos, that corporation was began really as a result of a lot of his work and knowledge and exploration. The big gas fields that are piped down to Moomba these days. It's said that he was the first vehicle to cross the Simpson Desert, and in fact Doug was on that trip. He was only a youngster back then, but he does remember it. McDowell Stewart's route and the subsequent overland telegraph line was to the west, and Burke and Wills's route was to the east. So for quite a while, this area in between, the Simpson Desert or Mungathiri National Park, went largely unexplored. Day 1 brings a pleasant but very cold evening at Madigan's Camp number 5. Well, it's breakfast on the Madigan. Beautiful sunrise this morning. It's kind of done now. We're having the breakfast of champions. Eating like kings, probably better than Madigan and his party would have been able to. Fresh fruit, muesli. Got the old jet bowl, whipping up some brew. I live in the dream. And so, on the 7th day, he rested. Right here. Sorry, it was a bad joke. Camp 7. So that's where we are right now on the Madigan line. Just pulled up for a bit of lunch. It's a perfect day in the desert. This is day 3 on the Madigan. We just left Camp 8. Off to do a bit more dune driving and living the dream. We made 3 camps yesterday. So we travelled about 75 k's. The Madigan's camps are roughly about 25 k's apart. Onward and upward for the Ox and Co. The dunes presenting no real difficulty at this stage, due to having been made quite firm by recent rains. It was a different story for Madigan's party though, and by this stage things were already beginning to look rather grim. Although rarely discussed, it's interesting to contemplate just how close the party came to failure. Camels can traverse large distances over many days without water, but not without sufficient feed. As Madigan wrote in his excellent account, Crossing the Dead Heart, Jack Bejar was becoming very concerned. He spoke of leaving one or two of the camels behind to follow us if they could. But this would have gone against all principles of exploration. Once you begin to abandon your gear, it is a sure sign of approaching collapse. You should not have any gear that you can do without. It was with great relief then that on the 11th day, with some of the camels nearing starvation, the party traversed yet another sand ridge to find this clay pan carpeted with Wangkangurru, a type of succulent which grows in arid regions and which provides excellent fodder for camels. The expedition was saved. So we're at Madigan's Camp 11. Now, by the time Madigan's expedition had reached Camp 10, he was a little bit concerned about the camels. They weren't holding up real well. They hadn't had a lot of feed. And only 2 dunes, probably about a kilometre from Camp 10, Madigan's expedition came across this place. From there, Madigan's expedition route starts heading on a more northerly direction. The reason he does that is because of his 1929 aerial surveys which he undertook, which he knew there were clay pans in that area. We'll actually go through some of those clay pans, including one known as the football field. Welcome to the football ground, mate. You got your tickets there? It's Geelong and Collingwood today.
Let's get out and play.
Yeah. Yeah, we're just waiting for the players to run on. It's a bit wet. It's going to be a wet match. Okay, so we're here at this clay pan. This is Madigan's clay pan. This is what they now call the football field, but there was a bit of a discrepancy in the original rerouting of Madigan's line, and Madigan's clay pan, which is referred to on the maps these days, is a little bit further south. This is the actual clay pan that Madigan came to and mapped and photographed, and quite beautifully there's in the little box here Madigan's diary. This is really nice. These are excerpts directly straight out of his diary, Madigan's own handwriting of all this, and someone's copied it and laminated it and left it in that box, so it's really nice for those Madigan enthusiasts, you know. With the danger now behind them and a slightly more relaxed air taking over the expedition, it was decided that now would be a good time to employ the dynamo-powered HF radio. The plan was to broadcast the signal from the desert, then on to another legendary mail truck driver, Harry Ding of Yunta in South Australia. From there, it would be relayed to the ABC studios in Adelaide. As Madigan writes, June 21st was the date set for the national broadcast at Camp 13. We camped early that day after covering 13 miles and crossing 74 small sand ridges. I had announced that this time Andy would be on the air. An Aboriginal speaking to Australia, which would be something new to broadcasting, and, coming from the heart of the desert, would make it even more unique. it was arranged that Andy should say a few words and then sing a corroboree song. We had some rehearsals of this, and on the night before, Andy had given a splendid performance. He lost all his diffidence and put his whole heart into it, leaping and gesticulating as he warmed up to his theme. He was soon quite unconscious of his surroundings and became transfigured. We watched him lose contact with us and drift into another world, a mysterious spirit world where he was a stranger to us. It was eerie in that desert darkness. We could not hope to put the full effects of this performance on the air. Andy said the song was about a dog, or dingoes, but it was not clear why it led to such dramatic intensity of feeling. When the time arrived for the actual transmission, I gave my talk and then introduced Andy. I could see his confidence oozing away as the moment approached. He was to say a few words about the song by way of introduction, but by the time I handed him the microphone, he was speechless. It was a lot to expect of him, and for a moment I thought all was lost. At last, he found a still, small voice and said, "Dog all about. Sing 'em good song," and launched straight into the performance. It lacked the fire of previous efforts, but it did not falter, and the sequence of strange cadences sounded quite typical and, I believe, went over very well. He gained more confidence towards the end, and when finished, he called quite boldly, "Good luck, all people in Australia." It was a good impromptu ending, and showed he understood what he was doing. Later in the evening, he suddenly said to me, "My nerves all gone." Sadly, this recording does not survive. But, so far as we can discern, it does mark the first instance of an Aboriginal person being nationally broadcast in Australia. Commendably for Madigan, and especially given the attitudes of the day, Andy was treated as nothing less than an equal and afforded the utmost respect by all members of the party. In fact, as the expedition wore on, Madigan came to be increasingly fascinated and grateful for the many unique insights which Andy had given him. Madigan recorded many of these fascinating insights in his diary. One particular example which captivated Madigan was a spontaneous remark about the very nature of overland travel itself. "This life good, walkabout," he said. "Homestead life no good. Live longer this way." A very profound truth, Madigan wrote, as applied to him and his people.